Okay, I think we can start. Hi everyone, I'm Min Teo from ConsenSys Labs, and welcome to the DeFi Summit. We're super excited to be partnering with this awesome team. I think my colleague Lex started us off on a great foot with his presentation. We're going to continue on with a little bit of a fintech angle here, because before DeFi, there was fintech. And especially here in the UK, I think it was probably, Eileen, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, people were kind of thinking like, is it fin, is it tech, what is this thing really? And so, we've gathered a panel of fintech experts, and hopefully they have some advice for DeFi projects, and can share their perspectives on how some of it might play out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Usman, Rija, Keith, and Eileen. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Great.
Sure, so Usman Khan, I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Apex E3. So I actually co-founded a fintech called Algomi back in 2012, which was a global bond information network. And then 7 years on now, I've started a data analytics company, which is also kind of a fintech, but let's see.
Hi, I'm Rija. I'm a technology leader. Most recently, I was at Market and Voice as a CTO, and prior to that, I was at Wealthfront, which is in the Bay Area.
Hi, I'm Keith Gross. I lead the UK for Plaid, which is a financial platform that allows users to connect their bank accounts to fintech apps, and we power many of the biggest fintechs across the US, Canada, and the UK.
Hi, I'm Eileen, and I'm a partner at Passion Capital, which is an early stage venture fund where we've done quite a bit of fintech. I'm also on the board for Monzo, and then I'm also the Treasury Special Envoy for fintech.
Great. So maybe to start us off, just asking a very basic question. So DeFi is really important to the blockchain community. It's emerged as this driving force that's really core to adoption, and it's spurring a lot of technical innovation. But for people outside of the blockchain space, what is your understanding of decentralized finance or open finance? What does it mean to you?
So I can hop in here to start. So I think our mission at Plaid is to empower innovation in financial services. So I think we see a lot of shared values in decentralized finance and in the blockchain space as well. I think one of the things that we found is that just in general, you're moving from a world where a bank was a one-stop shop for everything you needed in finance to a bank account becoming a routing hub for all sorts of different financial services for end users. And decentralized finance is sort of an iteration of that as well. So I think I see a lot of shared value and excitement in the changes coming in that space.
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing that a little bit more as well too. While fintech is all about disrupting traditional industry, and no matter how much mission-driven you are, that, hey, it's going to be like tech first, ultimately you are having to deal with the constraints of that traditional industry, and there's a lot of bureaucracy that's associated with it. So even if you're trying to build your own system, as an example, we did that at Wealthfront, you're still working with 36 different third parties in traditional industry, as well as like something right at the top like DTCC. So there's a lot of bureaucracy associated with it, which creates a lot of internal challenges and overall scalability, both from the tech side as well as like business finance. So just echoing what Keith said, I think purely based on that basis of trying to give developers a lot more control and decentralizing it and removing that bureaucracy is, I think, a welcome change.
Sure, so yeah, echoing the panel, but maybe slightly differently. I mean, ultimately finance, I think, just in broad terms, is about the management of money. So as an individual, a bank account manages my money. On a governmental level, they manage your money in some way, shape, or form by issuing more or less. And at an institutional level, and you want the management to be secure, you want it to be cheap access, fast access. And so ultimately, as a consumer in the mainstream, there's an outcome that I'm looking for with respect to money, and that's all these things: accessibility, security. I think decentralization as a term is a very interesting term. It's hard to define per se for me personally, because what is it exactly in the context of finance? Is it just another efficiency of some kind? Does it bring more security, etc.? So in and of itself, what is it? That's actually a question I still have.
Great. I mean, hopefully we'll have good discussion on a lot of those topics that you guys raised over the next 2 days. But, this is a question, maybe like Eileen can give some thoughts on this. But, one thing that a lot of fintech companies went through was bootstrapping the network, and that's something that DeFi, projects are definitely experiencing now. And, what advice do you have for DeFi projects as they think about, really surfacing the benefits of DeFi and bringing more users on board?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I guess I didn't chime in the last question, but I think it's probably related, which is, I think that the lessons of maybe early fintech companies or algorithm, in that first generation, was that really, as you mentioned, we should think about what the benefits are to consumers, or really what the impact is to consumers. And actually, at the end of the day, I think as little impact in terms of overhead and infrastructure as possible is better. What they should be seeing are improvements, speed of access, accessibility, and response times, but everything else really doesn't matter whether, frankly, it's even centralized, decentralized, but for us, we all recognize that decentralized should actually bring about greater transparency and take away intermediaries and make the whole process, more efficient, which is great, but it only matters if that actually trickles through to the consumers, right? So I think the sort of, not necessarily lessons, but certainly things that we saw in fintech were that there was so much emphasis on the principles of what companies were doing that we may have lost sight of whether or not there was enough consumer benefit to either justify, warrant, or maybe even be the kind of bleeding edge to push that forward. And I think it's important not to sacrifice consumer benefit. And I think we'll talk a little bit later also about regulatory oversight, because you're dead in the water if the regulator decides that. And so we I think, are all quite idealistic about the merits of DeFi, but I think we have to be quite pragmatic about what could end up crippling what is a very, very sound, advancement in principles. I don't know if that was a very not succinct answers.
I think I'll echo that. I want to focus on accessibility as a big part of this. I think you need to make something that's easy for users to access and control. And so I think you need to get to a point with your network where the user experience mirrors what you see in traditional fintech offerings today. And you need to ruthlessly prioritize solving a problem for users and developers. I think it's one thing to educate people, but if you're actually solving a problem for them and they're aware of it, that's where you start to get the traction and sort of the virtuous cycle going of growing your company.
Yeah, it's like, for example, we all probably have debit cards and credit cards, but who actually knows what Visa is and the infrastructure behind Visa? Not many, but they obviously know what the debit card or credit card does. It gives them access to their deposits. So yeah, I echo that.
Yeah, definitely echo a lot of those thoughts. And one promise of DeFi, as you mentioned, I think definitely lies in potentially overcoming some barriers imposed by third parties, maybe some architectural constraints when it comes to scaling. Do you sort of agree with this sentiment, or what are your thoughts? Rija or Usman?
Yeah, sure. Again, it's quite a broad question, but from an architecture perspective, we know that decentralized protocols do have a challenge around scalability in terms of transaction times, and what we're seeing are, the off-chain initiatives coming into place, which, from an ideological perspective, some argue actually are bringing back a form of centralization to this decentralized world. So, it's interesting how we want to be decentralized, but we're going towards centralized solutions. And so scalability, security, for example, a smart contract is immutable, but at the same time, we know contracts have amendments, they change over time. So that's something that also needs to be considered here. So scalability is still an ongoing challenge in this space. In terms of the fintech world, scalability was always an issue as well. But again, it comes back to what is the outcome, what is the objective you're trying to achieve. Is it faster payments? Is it faster access to your deposits? And the technology architecture needs to then reflect that. If it happens to be blockchain, great. But if it doesn't, I think that's also great. I hope that I'm not swearing here by saying that. But I think it ultimately comes down to the outcome you're trying to achieve.
I think a little bit more interestingly, definitely agree that there's scalability challenges in both definitely fintech and DeFi to what I've heard. But what's interesting about DeFi is that you're trying to remove that bureaucracy. So it's more so on that Ethereum network if you can ultimately go ahead and scale that. Versus in fintech, you're working within the constraints of that traditional finance industry, and no matter how much you would want to try to scale that and put a lot of effort in it internally as well too, you're still bounded by the constraints of that traditional industry, and they're just not going to move at the same fast pace as you. So at least in my perspective, I might be totally off base here as well too, because I don't necessarily know that much about DeFi. It seems like while there's scalability challenges in both, for DeFi, it's more so on the developer aspect, and ultimately you guys having that control, you can ultimately try to scale that network, versus it's just a very uphill battle trying to do that in traditional industry.
Well, I mean, just one more point on this, sorry, unless anybody wants to make a point. I do understand, blockchain, Bitcoin, when I read the white paper around the concept of solving the double spend problem, right? And you need a blockchain to solve the double spend problem from a verification perspective. What becomes interesting is the application of that in the other industries, and why do we want to actually apply that type of concept to other industries? I think that's a very important question, because the whole industry has grown, in my opinion, as a result of that initial first concept. And I see people trying to apply that concept to industries where I'm not sure it's necessarily needed, but there are definitely industries where it is needed. For example, consensus-based payment transactions. So I think there is, from what I can see, there is an ideological movement around this area, but there's also a very important and pragmatic, practical oriented movement as well. And I think the latter is going to gain a lot more success, I think, if they actually look at the world as it is and see how blockchain fits into the world today and augments it, as opposed to replacing it.
And I think I want to echo another side of scalability here, where it's not just on the tech side and throughput and having the infrastructure, it's also scalability from a user growth perspective. And so I think making it really easy for users to access their financial data, understand it, transport that to other networks, I think is going to be an important part of getting that cycle going. I think that's an aspect of scalability that needs some focus.
Yeah, and speaking on constraints, I think one of the largest one that Eileen touched on is regulation, and it's something that I think the UK has been a great place for people to build fintech startups, because a lot of clarity and regulation. And I mean, Eileen, as one of the earliest investors in Monzo, and being very close to that whole vintage of Revolut and TransferWise, before there was a lot of regulatory clarity. Do you have any thoughts as to how the regulator sort of views this space, and how regulation for DeFi might pan out, in the UK or globally?
So I don't have any predictions or insight, unfortunately and conveniently, which would beg the question of why I'm here. But I do think, having learned and been exposed to the regulator much more in these last sort of 3.5 years than ever before, and also sort of having meetings with them as envoy, this is going to sound like I've totally drunk the Kool-Aid, but just bear with me while I talk through this. I have come to appreciate that they don't see themselves, rightly or wrongly, as constraints. They try not to see themselves as admin and overhead. Obviously, it's almost impossible not to be that. But what I realize they do see themselves as, and I did not appreciate 3.5 years ago, is a champion for consumers. That might be dead obvious to all of you, but for me, I really never thought of them that way. I actually was like, they're overhead, they're admin, they're a burden. We're going to have to think about the cost of compliance. We're going to have to think about regulatory oversight. And I always saw those as investment areas and costs that we had to bear. I'm not just speaking about Monzo, but I think just generally across the sector, and even on PLC boards, for example. So I always saw it as that way, and maybe as we describe as constraint. And what I've come to appreciate, like I said, it might be that I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but this does come through in conversations, even when it looks like they are imposing a fine, a penalty, or talking about breaches. They see themselves as, rather patronizingly, frankly, as a consumer myself, as there to protect the consumer. They really think that they are there to protect the consumers from themselves and from making errors in judgment that they don't expect consumers to be sophisticated enough to understand. And this, for me, was a huge revelation. And I do think it's really, paternalistic, maternalistic, whatever, hugely patronizing, and probably flies in the face of what we talk about with DeFi, where you want it to be completely transparent, accessible, no intermediaries, literally as democratized as you can be. It strikes me that a regulator will be terrified of that, not because of innovation and accessibility and consumer benefit, but because of consumers who might not be sophisticated enough, frankly, to handle it or to make the right decisions. And it's almost like, in the US, this debate about electoral college votes versus actually counting the votes of voters. There is a view from a financial services infrastructure standpoint that consumers will not know enough, or in general, the most general population won't be sophisticated enough to make these decisions for themselves. Hence regulation, hence advice about how you have to state things, how you have to declare things, how you have to disclose things, and that's where they're going to be coming from. So I do think that's going to be a huge, huge, huge challenge. But I think it's maybe slightly helpful to think about the fact that they're trying to be altruistic, even though it's grossly, patronizing. That is their point of view.
I would echo that point. I think you have to think of them as the champions of the consumers and having their minds and hearts as the focus. I also think, though, in my experience working with the regulators, particularly here in the UK, they've created sandboxes and are very open to proof of concept ideas. And I think if you work with them, it can be a slow process, but it can be a very fruitful process as well. And so I think that's something that people should consider as they move forward, is instead of trying to work around anyone, you should work with them. Because I think ultimately that will be the way that you get some mainstream adoption.
I should have said that. Nice. He's drunk the Kool-Aid too.
Yeah, I think I've drank a bit of Kool-Aid on this as well. And in the context of Algomi, when we created the Global Bond Information Network, the regulators were all over us saying, hey, what is this thing? Are you transacting? No. Are you giving advice? No. We're managing information. And it's about information flow. And they're like, well, what's that? Right? And so a whole bunch of new regulations started coming into play around, if you're a platform, connecting banks, asset management firms, and actually you're just providing information, that also needs to be governed, right? And so all of a sudden we had to file for all these different exceptions. So to the point, absolutely, the regulation is going to be a big thing with respect to this sector. And I think, as Lex mentioned in his talk, you should prepare for it, anticipate it, and you're better for it.
They do mean well, though, but they are scared of what they don't know, right? So if they don't know about it and they don't know what it means, their first reaction will be basically kill it. Oh, there's a fly flying around, I'm just going to kill it. But if you, to that point, if you help them understand it, they are very, very receptive to that, really open. They pride themselves on being champions of innovation, especially here in the UK. But if they don't understand it and they see it, they will just try to kill it, just because that's the first reflex, right? If they haven't had a chance to come up to speed, because they will worry about any unintended consequences and risks.
Yeah, I think someone had a great quote where they said the regulator doesn't like the blockchain space because they don't know who to call or who to play golf with, and I think that's kind of true. I think with that though, a lot of it is also just control over the monetary supply, right? How do you think about cryptocurrencies and how they map with fiat? Do you think they're alternative? Can they sort of be mutually beneficial mediums of exchange together?
Yeah, I think so. So Apex, we're actually trying to understand this. We're trying to understand how fiat-based instruments can potentially work alongside, or can be investable alongside digital assets or cryptocurrency. And we're just trying to analyze that, and they can to some extent, as long as you have custody, things are secure, KYC is done. I'm talking from an institutional investment perspective. Bitcoin, Ethereum, some of the other coins are actually becoming investable instruments in some of these domains. And so some portfolios are now becoming, a small percentage of those portfolios are digital assets, right? So this cross between fiat and crypto is happening, I'd say, but there's still a long way to go. I think that the key thing here is that fiat is here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. If we think it is, I think we're dreaming. And crypto is also here to stay. Okay, the market cap is small relative to fiat, but there's a big movement behind it. Everybody here hopefully supports it. And, you know, it's here to stay as well. But I think we'll continue to see synergies between the two.
Any more thoughts? Great. You know, another question I had was actually with regards to building teams. So, you know, Raja and Usman, you've both, you know, built and managed teams of like, you know, more than 100 engineers for scaling fintech companies. And hiring, you know, especially in a very competitive market like London, like San Francisco, like New York, is always a challenge. Do you have any like sort of thoughts on how we can bring more experienced developers to the space and sort of get them to drink the Kool-Aid?
So my philosophy for generally hiring is I don't necessarily think that they need past expertise in that particular industry. When I first joined Wealthfront, I actually didn't even know what mutual funds was, and I built the support for that after first launching the mobile app. So whenever I'm hiring people, I'm more so focused on there's cultural aspects in terms of kind of like, you know, are they hungry, are they ambitious, do they actually want to go ahead and like transform just not the company and make that successful, but the people around them. There's definitely, I think, core engineering skills that you do need, but language and domain expertise is, I think, something that good people, regardless of which function they come from, can quickly kind of like pick up on the job. And it's more so about being eager to learn and being super flexible. Just a little bit more so nuanced, though, in terms of, and I think we were kind of discussing that a little bit before, and I've probably shared more so with Min in some conversations, is so I've been in London for a little over a year or so, and prior to that, pretty much all my professional history is more so in the Bay Area. There is, to what I can see, there's differences in the tech culture. I do think you can find good raw talent everywhere. So I think it's more so about being able to nurture that talent, and the focus being that that person, no matter which function org they're in, whatever their title is ultimately they want to become a business leader, particularly in a startup, and they want to help make the company successful, but also the individuals around them. Versus sometimes in not so empowering cultures, which you can have is like, this is the org chart, this is exactly what your role is. And sometimes in not so great engineering cultures, engineers are treated more so like code monkeys or ultimately IT or lackey. And that's one of the challenges that I've seen in fintech as well too, when you're working with people from traditional industry, their mental models are just totally different. And so they're more used to IT, and that's some of the terminology you'll need to get used to. And just both for the engineer first, ultimately kind of like onboard them onto that culture, and for the engineers talking to the non-technical people to be able to understand the different mental models to come to the same cultural understanding.
Totally echo all of that. I guess some of it comes down to the phase your company is in. So when you first start out and you're trying to find your fellow founders, if you need founders, if you're trying to go alone, that's a different challenge. There's a whole different type of, I'd say, personality you're looking for. So for example, you want somebody who, you know, firstly believes in the vision of the business. And if it's a technology company, they also have engineering capability. For me, the founding team is really important in terms of who that's made of. And then as you grow your company, you know, many of the things that we mentioned absolutely kick in. But I think a lot of it, what I found in the 7 years of Alchemy and, you know, and building this team, what's really important is clarity of purpose, right? And the clarity of the roadmap and the business problem you're trying to solve. And your entire team looks to you for that, right? Or looks to management for that, or wants to be part of that. Is the product working, right? That actually is critical to the success of the company, and actually the culture of the company as well, because there comes a point where, you know, you're trying to invest in what I call soft stuff, right? You know, nice pods to sit in, nice rooms to sit in, nice views as well. And all of that's great and helps, but then when the company faces challenges, right? People don't value those things. People actually want successes. They want the product to work. And so having a very focused understanding of what the business is trying to achieve and being able to communicate that to having that in a very clear form, I think attracts people to the firm. And with respect to DeFi, I think clarity of what we're trying to achieve is really important, to be able to state that, to actually attract such talent so that we can move forward with good talent in this space.
I think I'll echo to Regia's point. Like what we look for when we're trying to hire someone is a builder mentality, because one of the scary but exciting things about being in a new space and a fast growing space is there's a vacuum. There's always more to be done, more responsibility than you have people. And you need to find the type of folks who are going to grow and take on that responsibility versus someone who needs a narrowly defined scope. So I think for us, it's less about, is this person an expert in this space, and more, do we see a spike that this person has the potential to be a real builder, and is someone that if you let them loose, is just going to grow and take on more and more. I think if you find those people and you bring them into your company, you'll find that they'll attract more people with the same mentality, and that's how you start to get a real team going.
Great. And so final question, and then we can maybe take some questions for the audience if there are any. I'm not sure how much you've been following DeFi, but is there an area of vertical in DeFi that you're excited about, that you think holds a lot of promise in terms of improving access, distribution, or customer empowerment?
This might be quite geeky, I don't know, but I'm really excited by initiatives like the Lightning Node Network, which are trying to speed up transaction speed. And I think things like that actually help take this to the mainstream. And then there's a whole bunch of other things, but that's one of the main ones right now.
So speaking purely on behalf of Keith and not on behalf of Plaid, I'm personally really excited about the idea of identity, and I have friends working in the space of figuring out how you can verify yourself and move that around and use that in onboarding processes. And I find that to be a really exciting, interesting space, because that's so critical to making any financial network successful, is being able to identify who someone is. So,
I think both are good points, actually. The Lightning Network is one that I've probably looked into a little bit more in this particular space, so I'm definitely excited about that. And not just vertical, but just my own personal, I don't necessarily want to say frustration per se, but maybe challenge with fintech or just traditional industry just tends to be those scalability challenges. So as more so an outside observer, I'd be very keen to see how DeFi figures that out.
I think one other thing I'd say, coming from fintech into this world, I actually really like the fact that data is much more accessible in this world compared to fiat. So for example, in the bond space, you have to spend millions of dollars a year to get access to real-time or live bond information, right? So you have a bond, it has all these attributes, it's priced on an OTC, over-the-counter basis. You have specific niche players pricing those instruments, and to access that information for your user base is notoriously expensive, and companies go bust just because of that. In this space, what's interesting is the cryptocurrency exchanges, pretty much the APIs are free, right? So if you could build infrastructure to access those APIs, you've got access to that information. Then it's the challenge of actually building infrastructure to process it. Pretty much most of the information that one can find on the blockchain is freely accessible. Right, so as long as that continues, I think this space is going to grow and flourish quite a bit.
Great. Any questions from the audience at all?
Thank you. My name is Dirk. I'm from DeFi Capital. So we've been talking about regulation for a bit, and when we talk about regulation, it's always about companies or individuals, but the big role model of decentralized finance is Bitcoin, of course, which is not represented by a company or individual. So what is your opinion on regulation in the context of Bitcoin?
I guess I can hop in here. I think the same principles stand, right? Where what a regulator is concerned about is if something happens to a consumer's finances, is there a safety net there? Is there a way for them to protect that consumer? And so I think regardless of whether there's a company or individual or if it's a network, the regulator is going to be most concerned with making sure that there is this compliance and safety net in place. And so I would expect that to be the main focus of any regulator looking at this, and probably why they're all taking a very hard look and thinking about the right way to approach this market, because there isn't a company or an individual to talk to, right? But I think you have to have that safety net in place before you can view something as with a stamp of approval.
I absolutely echo that. And so I think what it comes down to, from the regulator's perspective, I've been having some discussions with a friend of mine who's at the FCA around this, is the first step is to try and classify it, right? Is it a security? Is it a utility? Right? And in fact, Bitcoin can be used in both contexts, right? And so if it's a security and people are using it as an investment vehicle of some kind, then the rules around investing kick in pretty much. And from what I understand, specifically the FCA, I'm not sure how the SEC are dealing with it or other organizations, but that's kind of the starting point to actually understand it. And then if you're an organization that's using Bitcoin as some kind of security, you will be subject to current security laws, essentially, which is where I believe they're heading. If it's a utility, that's a separate question. Does the utility become a security? Again, that's something they're also looking at. So, yeah, pretty much the existing regulations around investments, around transfer, payments, etc., the Consumer Protection Acts around all of that will still apply.
Okay. Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Sammy. My question is with decentralized finance, I see an end game that it's basically not for profit, right? So like everything is decentralized and owned by the people who use it. Obviously, that's an end game. In that time, what do you see as the things that can / should be for profit? And what do you see as the things that will make the most money?
I mean, obviously, you have. It's a good question. I mean, right now you have exchanges and you have traders, hundreds of thousands of traders around the world, retail traders on those exchanges. Essentially, they're speculating, and they're making money, from buying and selling Bitcoin at different prices. When it's volatile, that's when we see activity increase on these exchanges. And then you have a whole bunch of alternative coins or currencies, that are essentially derivatives of Ethereum, that are also traded on these exchanges. So one area where people are making a profit, even in fiat terms, is speculating on these exchanges. I guess if one day, crypto becomes a currency like fiat, I'll just say it, right? Becomes a currency like fiat, then, I guess and it's a medium of exchange that people use if I want to buy a coffee, then I set up a company that sells coffee and I take Bitcoin. I come, if my manufacturing is efficient and I can make a markup on my coffee in Bitcoin, then I'm making profit in Bitcoin, essentially. So it's just, when do we get to that stage where this medium of exchange functions like the medium of exchange today, in my humble opinion.
And I think the other thing, just to get back to like sort of the pure economic basis, is if you're providing value, there will be value to extract there. So I think the places in decentralized finance where the most value is being provided to users and developers will continue to find ways to monetize that value. I think one thing that you're seeing today in terms of exchanges is you need to grow the networks in terms of users, and so you need fiat on-ramps, and that is providing real value, and you're seeing companies capture real value in that sense. Whether that continues in the long run, who can say? But I think wherever you're providing value, there will be economic value to extract. And I think that's important because you need to be able to reinvest in things like compliance, regulation, improving user experience. I think without finding some source of profits, it's hard to see producing those gains in terms of the actual product value itself.
Yeah, I think from an investment perspective, we're constantly thinking about addressable market, value capture as it relates to DeFi. And really, the efficacy of a lot of these projects is that, marketplaces, platforms, they're really reduced to dumb pipes, if what we're doing is correct. But one thing that I think will sustain is customer loyalty and how do you kind of have an emotional relationship with your consumer. We're just talking about superhuman and how it's, you know, kind of ludicrous that people pay $1 a day for email when you have Gmail, right? That works fine, like myself included, by the way. So I think ultimately we have to think about DeFi, you know, not as feature-driven, not as, you know, something that's functional, but something that's quite emotional, because I think people are emotional about their money, they're emotional about their assets, budgeting. It's the same thing like they are emotional about dieting. So how do you sort of tap into that user behavior and extract that customer loyalty? I think that's the real challenge for DeFi.
Yeah, so speaking about regulators being the champion of consumer, yeah, perhaps thinking more you know, from the perspective of, you know, Bitcoin holders and, you know, gold holders. I mean, that kind of, yeah, gold bug, like that kind of perspective. Like, what if the, you know, the regulator has actually, you know, failed at their mission? I mean, what if, you know, the whole, you know, regulatory system, including, you know, central banks have actually, you know, failed to impose, you know, fiscal discipline in particular. So what if, you know, that failure is going to become apparent? So, I mean, do you see that within the realm of possibility that regulators themselves are going to be disrupted because they've actually, you know, failed at what they were supposed to do?
Totally. I think as a company, if you're just relying on the regulators to tell you what's good and what's bad, and don't actually have any internal, like your own like security, compliance, legal, and whatever other practices, then that itself is a problem. You're there to service your customers, and you're there to protect them as well too, right? Just kind of my own personal experience, having worked with regulators both over here as well as in the States as well too, they're still coming from that traditional industry aspect. Tech generally, like not necessarily like say fintech, and I'm sure DeFi even more so, is just something that's very, very new to them, and how they work. And so it's really hard for them to then understand the intricacies of what they're trying to do. And I mean, reg tech is itself an own industry, right? And trying to come that up. The thing that I find interesting about regulation though is, the regulators, again, kind of coming more so from traditional industry, for them, compliance and all of this is more of a binary situation, like this is right, this is wrong, you must do that. Whereas from more of a business standpoint, the way you're trying to assess that is more the spectrum and what exactly is the risk associated with it and where do you want to fall within that and how do you actually go ahead and mitigate it, which is possibly a little bit off topic, but to your point, yes, I definitely think so.
I don't see regulators failing. I see them evolving, essentially, with the time. But just philosophically speaking, if I may, you know, just to take the UK, it's trying to be a democracy of late. I'm not sure, but it's trying to be a democracy, and you know, we elect representatives to the Houses of Parliament. They make laws. These regulations come from those laws, and ultimately, the intent or the spirit, you know, behind these regulations is to protect people. Ultimately, so you know, if they fail at that, I think that has consequences on all of us, right? So, you know, I don't actually see them failing. I see them evolving, trying to understand, you know, what we're doing, and basically just trying to help guide us. I agree they take time. A lot of the stuff we're doing is new to them, but you know, there is definitely a sincere effort by the regulator to try and accommodate all these unknown and so-called, you know, dangerous-looking technologies, assuming they conform, right, to regulations that ultimately protect all of us.
Any other questions? Cool, great. Well, thank you guys. Really appreciate you taking some time to speak with us. I think I might have to schedule up follow-ups with you guys. So we also have an hour of user testing with, you know, get you an Archon wallet, set up a CDP on Maker, and also purchase a, you know, self-balancing token set on set protocol, so you can finally drink the Kool-Aid of DeFi. But thanks for your time.